Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of Show to Be with Mike G, the show of life, the show of San Antonio, being a professor, and Tequila Wars. It is my absolute pleasure to share this conversation with James Beard-nominated author Ted Genoways as we discuss his life, his father, his travels, and his new book, Tequila Wars. You get a bit of the tidbits, some fun historical facts about Jose Cuervo and the history of tequila. It is riveting, it is drenched in blood, and so much more. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this great conversation with Ted Genoways.
Dad, when I was growing up, did a lot of international travel. He was all over the world. And he always said that any great story was also evidence of bad planning. And that was, I kind of live by that, you know, it's always great when you come through a scrape and you've got this kind of funny story of some weird near miss. But generally speaking, it means that you got a little careless or you got yourself into a situation that you didn't know you could get yourself out of.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't want to speak ill, especially of friends of mine who have gotten into those situations. Generally, they're, you know, taking on a certain risk before they go. You know, they're going into a war zone or whatever. I try to steer clear of that as much as I possibly can.
Of course.
You know, I've had fun situations where things get a little bit hairy in one way or another. But generally speaking, they're not actually dangerous.
Okay.
You know, one of the stories I always tell, I guess, is that you know, I think there are a lot of people who have a fear of flying and so on. My fear of flying, whatever extent that existed, was completely taken care of when I traveled with my dad in Suriname in 2008. It was all single engine planes all around the Amazon.
Yeah.
And that situation was just felt kind of crazy to me. The weather conditions were really unpredictable, flying low over the treetops. There's also a habit of the bush pilots to try to save gas that they just stall the engine as they're coming into land. So they have like very little control over the plane.
My gosh.
And so, you know, those are some of the things that those are built-in risks that you assume by being in a place where people are doing things in a different way. But generally speaking, in any situation where it's like a person-to-person risk, like where, you know, I've heard plenty of people traveling around Mexico who have ended up in situations, you know, gun to their head and that sort of thing. That I try to make sure that does not happen.
That makes two of us, in fact. You can see there's a great story. I don't know if you know Ben from Malbien Mescal. Great guy if you ever get to meet him. But he's got. I like that.
I think that's housekeeping.
No, that's okay. They can come in. Well, it makes perfect fodder for the background noise and everything, which is totally fine. But then the end of that story, and have him tell you that sometime if you're ever in LA, that the truck ended up on fire. I'll just put it that way. And it's a great, the way he tells it is so dramatic. But so for you, luckily, the traveling that you've done, the situations that you've been in, relatively above board, been pretty safe.
Yeah, I'll say, so probably the most harrowing thing that's happened, it didn't exactly happen to me personally. It actually happened to my wife, Marianne Andre, who is also a journalist. She travels with me a bunch of times. We were in Oaxaca, and we were at Mezcal Tospa.
Oh, Tospa, yeah.
And and Edgar was with us, and we had gone out to see where they plant the espadine on the ridge line.
Yeah.
And when they shear off the pencas with machetes, and then when they uproot them, they roll them down the mountain down to where they do the baking. And the whole idea is that these things come crashing down the mountainside. And Marianne was like, this would make an amazing photo from down below of these things like coming crashing down the mountainside. Right. And the whole time I'm like, I don't think this is a good idea. Like, I think these things are, I mean, these pinas must have been 350 pounds, right. And they're not sheared off clean the way they are with a blue agave and a koa. So this is like a 350 pound spiked ball. That's right. Yeah. That's going to come spinning down the mountainside at you at 30 miles an hour. And so she's set up, she chooses a spot that she's going to get the photo. And I felt so bad for this kid who was up at the top, who was one of the harvesters, because he starts into this kind of soliloquy about like that he comes from this very small village, that they're very impoverished, and that he's worked very hard, and that he wants to lift his family up, and he's hoping to get into politics someday.
Right.
And I'm like, what is he talking about? And I suddenly realized that he's basically saying, like, if I kill this white lady right now from the U.S., like, I'm not going to get to do any of this.
Oh my gosh! Okay.
and she's like, no, send it down. And he pushed the pina down, and I mean, it was like it knew where she was and was coming for her. And she kind of did this kind of funny shake and bake, like she was trying to fake it out. I was like, and then bailed out at just the right time. And she can tell you that, I mean, it was probably 20 minutes before I was able to talk to anybody. I thought she was done for. And we had heard from Edgar, like, he's lost the vision in one eye because when he was harvesting, that there was a rock that splintered off and went into his eye. And he tells that story of, like, it took an hour to walk up to La Chirihuahua, and then it took 6 or 7 hours to get from there into Oaxaca City. And I mean, so it had already been made clear to us, like, if you have a medical emergency out here, will be hours and hours before you get to a hospital, and then you're in a hospital in Oaxaca. And so I couldned find my words for 20 minutes. And
as a writer too, that's a little impressive, isn't it?
but we did a fair amount of drinking after that, once we finally kind of caught our breath from it.
It's a beautiful place, and sometimes we don't really like that drive up there.
Yeah.
That you're like, well, we could probably fall off the side of the mountain. I mean, it seems plausible. Maybe not. It's possible, but yeah, that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about writing and traveling in Oaxaca and traveling throughout that city. So in that state. So 53 today. This is a really nice privilege for me too, right? And it's not about the number. It's just about a moment to, like, kind of reflect. You got 6 books, again, prolific writing for decades, right? And you can take that as a compliment or not. I know some people are bad with comments. Just the numbers are there. You've put out so much work. And so at this point, having had so much work that you've done in this new book, Tequila Wars, which we'll talk about, do you ever take moments to reflect on what you may deem as your success, or if success for you is just the work itself?
It's a great question. And this is actually a really great moment to catch me for that, both the birthday and, I mean, the first book event was just 2 or 3 days ago. I mean, this
is that in Tucson?
Yes.
Yeah, I saw the picture of you and
Agave Heritage Festival. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's really, really fresh that I'm getting a chance now, after years and years of working on this in solitude, to finally talk to people about it and to explain, like, and for many years, people were always asking, like, what is taking so long? And I was like, I can't even explain it to you. Like, you'll understand when you see it. But this book, certainly of all of them, it's probably the one that I'm proudest of in terms of just the sort of range of skills that it required.
Yeah.
And there were plenty of times when I wondered if I was actually going to be able to stick the landing on this thing, because there were so many different ways of trying to approach this. And my original thought was, I'm going to do something that's just a kind of survey of the contemporary industry and do it like that. But there were other books that were coming out and doing that.
Clayton's book, for instance, right? Yeah.
And doing that so well. And Clayton's a great example, like somebody who just knows the technical side and has been everywhere, knows everybody. And it was just like, I'm not going to be able to do that. But the thing that I was interested in was the history. And yet when I went and talked to the tequila makers and asked them, like, can you tell me a little bit about your family history? Had a few scattered stories and a little bit of like sort of family lineage, but they didn't really know the stories of their own families.
Wow.
And so I got fascinated by that, but it also meant that I didn't have any help. I didn't have their assistance. I didn't have any guidance at all. Nobody knew what the stories were. And everyone kept saying, in fact, it's all lost. They just said,
always that way, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's just how we do it.
Yeah.
It's all just lost.
And they said, you'd hear, well, everything was destroyed during the revolution. After the revolution, everybody was very shy about putting anything down on paper, that you don't want to leave a trail. And it was all word of mouth. Nobody remembers, and that history is just gone. And, my instinct told me that couldn't be completely true.
Right, it can't be.
And yet there are some really challenging gaps. That it is true that the municipal archives in Tequila were burned 4 times during the revolution. The records in Guadalajara were burned 5 times during the revolution. And so there are key documents that just are completely gone.
Yeah.
And so it's often just a sort of trick of triangulation, trying to figure out as you advance through just a chronology, okay, here's the set of documents that exists that helps to tell this era, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be the same for the next era. And so that process of researching and writing, figuring out how to find documents from the 1880s didn't do you any good for figuring out how to find documents from the early 1900s. Right. It's just it's a different research problem. And so, the archives are incredibly fragmentary and scattered, and in many cases they've been moved around in Mexico too, and gotten disorganized in the just in the movement from one place to another. And so it was just a constant challenge. And eventually what ended up happening was basically just choosing an approximate starting point and moving forward. And each set of documents would start to give clues to where to find the next set. And so, I always think of that great line from E.L. Doctorow where he talks about writing a novel. And he's like, it's like just following your headlights when you're driving in the dark.
Right.
It's like it doesn't illuminate the whole path.
Right.
It just illuminates the little bit in front of you, but you just keep following, and it'll get you all the way home.
Yeah. And
that's kind of what this was. That as I was working on one period, I had no idea how I was going to address the challenges of the next period, but you just had to do it kind of one step at a time.
And I saw that you thanked Guillermo in the foreword of it. I imagine he was quite amazing gentleman, but
yeah. Well, Guillermo's key in this whole process for sure.
Yeah.
In the research of the book, there are these public records that are scattered all around, and you get a few documents here and a few there. I knew that there was a collection, the Souza family collection, and eventually discovered that Guillermo was the keeper holder of that collection.
Really? I didn't know that. Okay.
And so I don't know how many years ago it was now, but 7-8 years ago, he let me into that collection and go through that archive. It is a similar problem, that it was cataloged and organized at one point and then moved a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be organized within a cabinet or within a drawer, but then you have to do a little bit of work to try to figure out, what goes where,
right.
Relative to the finding guide. But within that collection and that, minimal challenge, there's this treasure trove of documents, and it's land records primarily,
Mm-hmm.
some tax records, but also the real key was that there's some family correspondence that's there.
Oh, wow.
And so there are some letters between Zenobio Souza and his sons, between Eladio Souza and his brother Luis Souza, and these letters actually provide a glimpse inside the family, and you see the dynamics of the family, and you see, where the brothers agree and where they disagree, how they work together, and how they also kind of divide their interests within the family business. And all of that is crucial.
Wow.
But then also within all those land records and tax records, which you'd expect to be kind of, dry documents, there's just, first of all, the kind of crucial piece of having, documents that have a specific date, so that you can say, okay, Jose Cuervo's distillery is producing this much tequila in this year, this much to the next year, this much to the next. And you get to see sort of the ups and downs of the production cycle.
Right.
And you can do that for most of the major producers for a whole period of years. And then you're able to kind of identify trends, right? Like places where everybody's up and where everybody's down. And that starts to be a clue for what's going on in the broader industry. And sometimes within those tax records, then there's an explanation. There's a fantastic document where Jose Cuervo is writing to the government and saying, that his distillery is back up and running at full production, sort of capabilities, but because of the economic crisis that's going on in the country at the time, that he's reducing production, that there's not demand for tequila at the time. And so there's this kind of narration of a particular moment in time that he's explaining his decisions.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And then it's a matter of like, okay, now I need to understand. He's writing in 1906 talking about an economic crisis. What was that economic crisis?
Yeah. Just on the heels of Prohibition coming too, right?
Well,
which is bound to be some kind of cultural shifts in that period, right?
Yeah. So overall, in the life of Jose Cuervo himself, so he took over running La Regeña in 1900 and ran it until his death in January of 1921. And in fact, had been the manager of the distillery for a few years before he actually took it over. And all of those years are pretty well documented within the government records. And what you see is this period where Cuervo's the manager, and then a period where he takes over when his uncle dies. Jesus Flores died in 1897, and Cuervo eventually married his uncle's widow, Ana Gonzalez Rubio, in order to take over ownership of the distillery. And from 1900 to 1909, 1910, he builds the business with this tremendous speed and does all kinds of innovative and important things. Improvements in distilling technology and patenting new kinds of ovens but then also, getting a railroad line built to Tequila and getting electricity brought to town. And so all of this kind of modernization and increased production and distribution, and then the revolution hits. And everything that he built gets destroyed by the revolution. And so there's that whole period of just trying to survive through that period. And then there's the rebuilding, and the rebuilding at first is pretty slow. It's Prohibition that in a lot of ways saved the tequila industry because all of a sudden their product had really high value if they could just get it across the border.
I love being from, we're both from Texas, but those stories of moonshining Sotol and El Paso and Juarez and things, it's a very profound and rich story. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit here because, you've been writing for quite a long time. But when I noticed that you studied creative writing, I asked myself, Ted, it doesn't seem like at least what's been published is, now you're a creative guy, but this is all like, this happened in 1897 until 1921. This happened, right? Where do you and how do you flex those creative muscles, of which I'm sure you were writing poetry, which you also studied. Yep. Where is that outlet for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, it doesn't ever feel as disparate as it might look,
Okay.
Because I've published 2 books of poems, but both books of poems are, the first book is kind of a multi-generational family history of my own family, which is not all that different from what I've tried to do with the Cuervo family in this book. The second book of poems is about a husband and wife who arrived in Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush. It's all based in archival research, but I wrote it as poems. It's a whole book of sonnets. And the thing that I guess that beyond that kind of research element of it all, I'm always wanting the writing, even when it's historical and nonfiction like this book, to be as vivid as possible and to feel like it's a lived experience, not something that is just a kind of dry recounting of facts.
Right.
And so that was the kind of challenge with this book was, okay, great that there are government records. Great that I know how many liters of tequila were produced at La Reina in this given year. But that doesn't tell me what Jose Cuervo was like. It doesn't tell me what the dynamics were between him and but at one early stage of the book, and this was the thing that really made me think, okay, this is possible to do as a book. I discovered in the literature that there are a few references to a couple of self-published books that Jose Cuervo's niece put out in the 1950s.
Okay, wow.
And it turns out that she was adopted by Cuervo and his wife when she was about 6 years old and lived with him all the way until his death. And so she, at the time, was a kind of avid diary keeper. Mm-hmm. And at the end of her life, using those diaries, wrote some brief essays as kind of remembrances. And they're very impressionistic. They're very, these sort of short, like, here's a 2-page description of one of our neighbors, or here's a 3-page description of 1 year that we had Easter celebrations in Tequila, or whatever. But her eye for detail is incredible. And she was a really vivid writer. And she was also very sort of careful in her observation of the way that people behaved. And so her description of Cuervo's wife, Ana, she absolutely loved, it's always this kind of outgoing and vibrant personality. She describes Cuervo himself as being kind of retiring and even shy, very methodical, but always kind of looking for ways to keep peace and to just maintain the calm that's needed for maintaining the business. And so, what emerges out of these essays is an impression of what these people were like.
Yeah.
And then some private scenes where you get glimpses of their lives. And what I saw sort of early on was that in the places where I could figure out where these vignettes that she was writing matched up with historical moments, that I had enough to create the context and enough from her to create the kind of scene and the moment. And and it all fit together.
The third dimension, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Because you've got now. See, I love this because, in a way, it's not opportunistic, but you're looking for the right alignment to where you can infuse texture,
Right.
infuse language,
Right.
color, and really make it a scene, like you said,
Absolutely.
a portrait, so to speak.
Yeah.
You mentioned sonnets, obviously poetry.
Right.
I grew up kind of an emo kid. I was in emo bands and
You
shit,
bet.
and, writing lyrics for many, many years.
Yeah.
Self-deprecating as one does, Do you consider yourself a romantic person?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think so. The thing that I see with all of this is that there's a kind of passion that runs through all of this, right? For me, that passion is in the research and the assembling of the pieces of the story, in finding the right words, the right details that make that story come alive. But the other thing that's really compelling in all of this is seeing the passion, the love for all of this that the people at the center of the story all feel. There is this love for tequila, for agave, for the land, for the culture, and for their country. And there are competing ideas of what all of those things should be. And the reason that they sometimes come into conflict with each other is that they believe in these things enough that they are willing to fight for their point of view.
Right.
And I find that compelling. I find that intensely human. And
it's more than a commodity.
Yeah.
Because often we think of tequila, and especially probably now, it's this many liter packs sold, this many exported. But I think the thing that you talk about going up and visiting Edgar, that's a painting. That's an experience. He's doing something not for the commodity value of it, but because it's cultural for him. And it's a connection. I've had the chance to interview him up there too, right? It's like, and so did you find yourself more in love with tequila once you finished the book?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, the region, the people, but somehow having the history woven into all of this. I love the town of Tequila itself.
Yeah.
I see it now in a way that I couldn't 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And, when I'm on the plaza in Tequila, in that central square, I see the bandstand and know that that's the bandstand that Jose Cuervo had built when he renovated the square. Yeah. It is also the place that Leopoldo Leal, with the backing of Ignacio Cuervo, declared the revolution to have begun in the town of Tequila.
Wow.
And so you see all of these things in a different way. To know that those obsidian cobblestone streets, that was a project that Cuervo paid for and led for the city.
Yeah.
If you've been inside the church, that distinctive parquet wooden floor was a floor that Cuervo had installed in the church. And so now, for me, instead of it just being a beautiful spot, there's stories that are attached to it. And I see, the ghost of Jose Cuervo in all of these places, the way that his hand in shaping the town is still present and visible. You just have to know where to look.
I love that, though. I mean, it is so romantic, And then people say, well, it's like love is romantic. It's like, well, it doesn't have to be a romantic love. It can be all these other kinds of shades of things. Upon looking at kind of, the massive amount of topics that you've wrote about, I asked myself this. I asked this about a lot of distillers, too, that there's generational or mezcaleros and things. Your dad published. Now, of course, it was sometimes about operating museum and organization and operations and museums and things. However, your dad was a very decorated author.
Yeah.
And in academia as well. Was there any sense that you had to follow in those footsteps, that you had to be a writer? Or is it just so ingrained in you because you were among it and your father, obviously a wordsmith as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I guess the thing that I would say is that both of my grandmothers were school teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so both of my parents were readers and were, cared about precision in writing and cared about, I grew up in a house full of books.
Yeah, sure.
And so that was just kind of ever present as a way of understanding the world.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, my dad was an academic, and he's still around
Doing
and still publishing work all the time. And so that kind of mentality of like, as you come to understand something new, that you write it up, you find some place to publish it, that just made sense to me in a kind of workaday kind of way, like that it didn't have to be anything that was that you held as something that was too mysterious or whatever. It was just you collected the facts, you wrote them down, you found a good way to structure it and put it out. Now, what I will also say is that we're a family of talkers, we're a family of storytellers.
I bet.
And the dinner table conversation when I was a kid, a lot of people around the table with interesting stories. And so if you're going to pipe up, you've got to have
make it worthwhile,
good material. You got to tell the story well.
And just real quick, that's how it was for Eddie Murphy when we grew up too, right? At the dinner table, but a different kind of material, but same thing.
But that's the thing. I mean, you listen to what makes a good story. You hear what connects with people around the table, and of course, also as it happens in families, there are stories that get repeated and repeated, and you're like, okay, this is something that makes this story endure. It's not just that it has its moment and gets a laugh or whatever, but it's something that feels meaningful to people, and you keep telling that story. And so that became, it's just second nature. It's just always looking for and just kind of instinctively recognizing when you find something that you're like, that's going to be something that really works and kind of advances the story in some way.
I think of Prince sometimes, right? Those early records, self-produced and everything. And he was always Prince, don't get me wrong. But there was a point in which he found his sound. He found his voice. And for you, was there a moment where you realized, I understand who I am as an author or a writer?
I will say the thing that I'll say again, I guess, the thing that I'm really proud of with this book is that it kind of used all of the skills that I've built over years, because some of it was going out and talking to people, asking questions and trying to make those personal connections. And some of it was just kind of painstaking archival research and just having the patience to go through, disorganized collections or documents that don't yield very much, but try to find one nugget here or there and slowly assemble that over years. But also, I do think as a writer that one of my particular skills, and I think I really developed this as an editor, is structural, to see how the architecture of a book allows us to tell a larger story.
The narrative ultimately, is that another word?
Yeah. And that narrative arc to me is important in terms of why are we telling this story at all? It certainly, you have moments that you're like, there's action here or there's conflict. We're seeing the human condition, all that. Great. But what is the story? What is really happening here? What is this adding to the conversation? And this book, because there wasn't always adequate material to tell every step of the story that I might have wanted to, it made that architecture especially challenging. Because there are places, one of Cuervo's great gifts was his willingness to disappear when he had to, when there was enough danger from revolutionaries, from government forces, whatever it may have been. When he needed to vanish, he did. And the trail will just go cold on him for stretches of time.
Yeah.
And so the challenge was, how do you narrate that gap? How do you tell the story?
Right?
Well, my one rule was, I'm not inventing anything.
Got it.
Like, nothing here is imagination. But what I can do is, in places, first of all, kind of interpret the gap.
Mm-hmm.
There's a moment where Cuervo kind of disappears for about 18 months, but the last thing that he tells the government is like, there is so much chaos in the country, it's not possible to keep the business open. And he's basically vacating the state of Jalisco. He's retreating back to Mexico City and just shutting down the business and all of that. And so you can interpret that absence. You can say, here's everything that led up to that moment, and here's what he's looking at and seeing. The in that particular instance, the train lines are all destroyed, and the economic situation is such that people can't afford to buy bread. They're certainly not going to buy expensive bottles of tequila. That you can do some interpretation, right? Sure. But in other places, it's kind of necessary to move the narrative a little bit to some of the other characters.
I see.
And so, as one example, there's a very dramatic and extremely well documented moment when Pancho Villa takes over Guadalajara and calls all the tequila makers and some of the other rich businessmen around the train station together for a meeting. And when they arrive, he tells them all that they have to pay a bribe, and he gives the amounts that everyone is going to be required to pay. Cuervo is ordered to pay the highest amount, and he pays the bribe without any kind of conversation, doesn't say a word. In a moment where there are people present transcribing the meeting, it's deeply frustrating to hear the guy doesn't speak.
Oh,
right?
My gosh, right?
That he's in the room, there's someone who's ready to transcribe it, yeah. And there's nothing there. And Cuervo disappears very shortly after that. But what I do have is, first of all, some consular records from the French consul saying that the word had gone out that Cuervo was being sought and that he was going to be arrested and going to be executed, and that he's one of several people who are being sought for arrest. And the other people did not vanish in the way that Cuervo did. And so it's possible to tell the story of what happened to them.
Oh, wow.
And they were, in fact, executed. And so, and one of them was, who objected to having to make this payment, is one of Cuervo's. I mean, he lived right across the street from Cuervo. And there's a detailed account of his kidnapping and then being taken out and put in front of a firing squad. And so in some cases, the narrative, we may lose sight of Cuervo, but we can, again, there's a way of interpreting, like, this is what totally would have happened to him.
Yeah. I say this both kind of embarrassingly, but also honestly. I love writing, but I don't enjoy reading. Because reading to me, it's not a chore, but it's a task, and I must finish it. So if I open a book and I crack it, it's just the thing that's priority one that I finish. So I lean towards cinema more, because I can be in and out in an hour and a half, 2 hours. And so do you take any kind of, because of course I'm going to ask influences here. I think Salt of the Earth, I think Steinbeck, but maybe it is, maybe not, right? But you take cinematic cues too?
For sure. Absolutely. And I mean,
you're talking about it in that way as a director would, right?
Absolutely. Because, I mean, yes, the literary influences, I think, are pretty apparent in some ways. That, if you're looking at a sort of generational drama that's around, a business that turns into a criminal enterprise, I mean, you're paying attention to, well, you're looking at The Godfather, you're looking at, you're looking at any of these things. And yes, I mean, Upton Sinclair and some of the people who are doing these kind of sweeping historical narratives, And some of it is really nitty gritty. I mean, there's a lot of gunfights in this book, and it was kind of a funny thing. I mean, I realized as I was going through reports and had detailed accounts of all of this, I was like, I've never written a gunfight before. I don't know how to do this. And so, Cormac McCarthy is a favorite of mine, and I looked a lot at like, okay, how does Cormac McCarthy write a gunfight? And so there are those kinds of influences, but I also think that it's just true that the way our brains work now, we have cinema as a frame of reference. Right. And so I also, I want the scenes to be as sort of visually vivid as possible. And again, Cuervo's niece, Lupe Gallardo, she had such a kind of visual sense in the way that she wrote that, I mind her writing for those amazing details as much as possible. And I love moments where Lupe, that she had this kind of instinctive use of pacing. There's a moment that I absolutely love where she's describing, it's a moment during the revolution, and it's super dramatic because the attack on tequila by these revolutionaries starts on the night of his birthday. Yeah. And so all of the tequila makers are gathered in his home. And so everyone's in one spot as the revolutionaries are like riding into town. And they've gotten word that they're a few miles out and that they're going to have to prepare for this evacuation. When they eventually get, and it's in the morning, when they get Lupe and Ana out of town, and Cuervo has sent for a hand car to be brought because the Southern Pacific won't bring the train that far up the track anymore because of the word of attack. They get loaded onto this hand car, and the rail workers are working that hand pump and slowly going the 20 miles to the nearest train station. And, there's, as they are moving along the track, there are other people from the countryside who are kind of coming into the easement along the tracks and streaming toward the train station. Yeah. So there's this moment of tension where the revolutionaries are at their back. You realize that there's going to be a chaotic scene at the depot when they get to the train station. And Lupe has this moment where she sort of turns and describes watching the fields of agave as they sort of slowly move through, and the electrical and phone lines have just been recently installed, and she's watching them as they sort of rise and fall over the poles as they're just creeping along these tracks. Yeah. And it's such a great thing, but just having these these details, you realize like your senses are so heightened in this moment because you know that there's about to be this explosion of chaos, and to have this moment of such quiet and calm is sort of unexpected, and it's an amazing pacing thing that she does.
I love that.
And just being able to draw from that material is such a luxury.
And I think of absolutely. Yeah. And actually, I think about when I first saw No Country for Old Men.
Right.
Thought opening day or whatever. In that moment where you expect all of this tension to build at the hotel, and then it fades to black. Right. I was so pissed at that movie, but it's that same kind of thing, right? You're just waiting for all of this to happen. So how you handle the tension, really, and I won't spoil it, but that's really where the artisanal kind of hand comes into play, right?
Right.
Well, I want to talk about so many things, Ted. I mean, I find my friend David, he was visited your talk yesterday.
Yeah.
He goes, I could listen to that guy talk for hours. And now I could too.
I'm not but sure we both that's know true of everyone.
That a narrative is best captured in an hour and a half.
Right.
Soderbergh is nailing it lately, like really, really nailing it. But I wanted to get your take because you've worked both in the what I would consider analog realm of journalism into the digital era. Is journalism still centered by integrity now? I felt for a long time, you think of Walter Cronkite, these older kinds of people representing the news, that there was a little more legitimacy to it. And I'm not painting it one way or another, but just in your opinion, how do you think modern journalism stacks up now?
Well, for my money, there's a greater necessity for journalists to be rigorously factual than ever.
Yeah.
There's so much misinformation and disinformation out there. There's so much that's just speculation and opinion and conspiracy theory, that if you're going to say this is factual and that you can trust us, then you have to have a really rigorous process, and you have to be willing to adhere to that.
Right.
And that's not always easy to do, because there are places where you feel 90% certain that you've got the facts that you need in front of you. You know that you know the story, but you don't quite have it.
Right, which is exactly what you were talking about.
Yes.
So do you choose to fill in those gaps, or do you?
And to me, the way that you build trust with readers today is by saying, you can rely on me, that I'm not supplying you anything here that's just out of my head. I've gathered these details, I've lined them up, I've checked them out, and that this is a factual account to the best of my ability. I'm not making this up. And, I'm a huge fan of fiction, and I think that fiction has an incredibly crucial role in sort of mining the human spirit and understanding the human psychology. That's not, to my mind, where the strength of nonfiction really is. I can't tell you for sure the psychology of Jose Cuervo. I can divine certain things, but I can divine those things from factual data points.
Right.
And I will share those data points with you, and I'll share some of my interpretation of it with you. But it's important to show your work. I mean, you say like, I'm not claiming that I found this in a source. I'm saying, okay, here are several accounts, and I actually do this in the prologue of the book, where there are contemporaries of Jose Cuervo who describe his temperament, and they all describe it the same way.
Okay, good.
So, this is, but I don't just say, that he was shy and retiring, and that he was, a peacemaker and those things. I do say those things, but also, here's what one of his friends said. Here's what another friend said about him. So that you understand that I'm not making this up. I'm not imagining this. I've done the work. Yes. I've found people who were actually with him, and this is what they said about him. Now, the thing that's also fascinating is that, some of Cuervo's own brothers, would say that he wasn't aggressive enough, that he wasn't, and it kind of gets passed down in the family history as well. He was a nice man, but he wasn't a great businessman. But what that really meant at the time was, he tried to do things through alliances and through political pressure, and not by force, drawing a gun.
Yes. Right.
And so, but that again tells us something clear about the guy, that when all of his brothers, when everyone around him was like, we should just take up arms and make this happen through force, and he wasn't willing to do that. Okay, we know something about the guy.
A diplomat, in a sense, yes. Very diplomatic.
And I just think that for, in that with that question of like, what's this question of integrity as a writer of nonfiction, to me that's the key thing, is that if we're going to call this nonfiction, then everything is based out of the facts that we were able to gather. And if there are gaps, you tell the reader there are gaps. If there are places where you're doing interpretation, you tell the reader, you signal to them, this is something that I'm going to interpret. But then the freedom of that, to me, the thing I love about what nonfiction can do. And I always tell my students this. I'm like, this is your one trick that you've got that nobody else has, so rely on it.
Mm-hmm.
You can move around in time.
Yeah.
It's tough for film to do that efficiently. You have flashbacks, but you flash back to scenes. You can't flash forward and back to sort of the particular motivations that someone may have that comes from years before. Mm-hmm. For example, there's a moment where Cuervo and his wife are married, and it's the scene where she is actually the one who has proposed to him and has lobbied him for several weeks to agree to get married, and it's another instance where he's sort of cautious and thinking things through, and I tell the reader, this is maybe the wealthiest woman in the state of Jalisco. There's always these mentions of how beautiful she is in the newspapers, and everyone, commenting on how beloved she is, and he's hesitant. And so this tells us something about Cuervo.
Interesting. Yeah, it does. It really does.
That presented with what would
silver
seem
platter.
to be, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And she owns the business that he wants to run and wants to take over, and he's still cautious.
Wow.
So that tells us something. But also, I wanted to work in there that is one of those stories that's handed down, that people tell that story, and every single Cuervo family member I met talked about the fact that, sort of laughed over the idea that Ana was the one who pursued him and had to convince him. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to say, and wrote into the book that, that 100 years later, more than 120 years later, this is something that the family still talks about, still jokes about. Mm-hmm. So we have this moment of flashing forward, but also then saying, but Ana had inherited this empire by marriage. She had run it successfully for several years on her own. She didn't have to do this. She's making a decision here of her own. And I want to kind of try to encourage us to interpret that moment on its own grounds. That she's essentially giving away a fortune, giving away an empire in order to marry this man. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's every reason to believe that this was a marriage that was a business union, but it was also but something that there was more there. That there was that, and in fact, they seem to have had this happy marriage then for the rest of Cuervo's life. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, but I think it's just, you got to just be straight with the reader.
I'm with you, and I what I'm kind of drawing is you're talking about these stories, you're talking about these dinner table stories, right?
Right.
The Cuervo family, generation to generation. I think about the stories you talk about your family telling at the table.
Yeah.
You're talking about Cuervo in a way that, not as far as to say you've been reincarnated, but you've revived a ghost.
Right.
In a sense. And with this research and probably coming closer to understanding the man than anyone besides someone that knew him, do you find any pieces of his personality, his story to be similar to yours? Do you find that you have things in common with him?
Well, I will say one thing, especially this is something on my 53rd birthday. I finished writing this just as I was about to turn 52. Mm-hmm. And Cuervo was 52 when he died.
Oh, wow.
Died young, died under strange circumstances. He and his brother, who was in the Mexican Congress, had dined together in Mexico City. Both of them fell tremendously ill the next day.
Oh.
There were rumors that they had been poisoned. His brother very nearly died, but recovered. Cuervo did not recover. And so in some ways it's the story of the rise and fall and then starting to rise again, but that's cut short by these crazy circumstances. Wow. And it seemed especially ironic to me because Cuervo himself, Jose Cuervo, had always been trying to keep the peace. And if in fact he was murdered, his brother was probably the target. His brother had been stirring a lot of trouble in the Mexican Congress, and if in fact one of his brothers being unruly and him not being able to, I mean, he was in Mexico City to try to kind of tamp down the rhetoric, and if he ended up being collateral damage, there's considerable irony in that. But I guess the thing that struck me was just the way in which the story that you always think that you're telling of yourself, that you kind of imagine a certain endpoint far in the distance, right?
Yeah.
and it starts to approach at a certain age.
Remember you were talking about your headlights in the dark?
Yes.
In that case, it's good. I can't see what I'm driving towards, right?
And that's the thing is that there's always the possibility that there's something that jumps into the roadway and cuts that journey short. And so seeing that, kind of reckoning with that with Cuervo himself on this project, I guess I do look at him as somebody who was tremendously important, made huge contributions. And I hope up until now, I hope that this changes that. But up until now, he's really been invisible. He's been a name on a bottle, and his whole life has been forgotten. And to some degree, I think that happened because of his early death. If he had lived into the era after Prohibition, if he had been a presence coming to the U.S. and people had interviewed him about his life at the end of his life and those sorts of things, I think we would have a much clearer picture of him from his own perspective. But because he was just at the outset of this rebuilding stage and was not even thinking about legacy, not thinking about any of those issues when his life was cut short, there is no version of Jose Cuervo looking back on himself. And so to arrive at that moment at the same time, I started thinking, well, what am I doing to kind of reflect on the things that I've done, to leave some record of what I've done, and it has made me think about those things a bit and think a bit about, well, is there more autobiographical writing that I want to do? Is there more of that kind of work? And I don't have delusions of grandeur. This is not for future historians to record. But I do think, I guess I came away from this project wondering, my son who's, in his 20s, if there are grandchildren or great grandchildren, I would want them to know certainly the things that were my obsessions, like this story of Jose Cuervo, but I would also want them to know something about me. And it's exactly what I was saying before, that this book, Cuervo's obsessions, his business obsessions, are one side of the story, but what was happening in his household, how he managed things with his brothers, how he was as a sort of stand-in father for Lupe Gallardo, or how he was as a husband, all of those things are really the bigger story of his life. And I guess it's left me thinking, well, maybe I want to record more than just my obsessions.
I love this because two things. One, that's the only reason I do the podcast, is because many of the conversations I've had, these folks have passed.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to really talk about Tomas, about love and Frank Zappa and drugs and things, and the things that he would talk about, Yeah. And so to that end, this, I hope, captures your life in its own way. But I asked this question the other day to a couple of friends of mine, and I'm not sure that I have an answer, so maybe it's cowardly of me to ask, although I could give an answer. But two things.
Yep.
What, top of mind for you, what two things would you like people to remember you as or remember you for?
Yeah. So what's interesting is I'll tackle the four first. I don't have particular books or poems or magazine articles. Like there are ones that feel like milestones for me, where I was able to do something that I hadn't done before, where I picked up some new skill as a researcher or as a writer or interviewer, whatever. But I don't think that that's necessarily the same experience for the reader, and so which of those pieces may work best, especially long term, that's kind of out of my hands. But I hope that anybody who would look at the body of work would see something of that sensibility, which is that I'm always looking for the human dimension in things, trying to find the story, trying to find the way that we connect to each other.
Yeah.
And, I've done a lot of work writing about immigrants in the meatpacking industry. I've done a lot of work, writing about the history of tequila. I mean, these things that would seem to be sort of wildly disparate. But what connects them for me is that they are glimpses of human beings doing human things,
Exactly.
And I would hope that a reader of the work sees that sensibility and would find some value in the way that I'm trying to connect in that way. Like, I think that there are some writers who are really focused on sort of technical artistry or the pyrotechnics of trying to do something with language or structural or whatever. The thing I'm doing is pretty straightforward in a lot of ways. I'm trying to make the writing a kind of clear pane of glass, that you can look through and you see the world, and you're not focused on the glass itself. You're focused on what it shows you. And yet what I would hope is that there's some appreciation for what that sensibility is.
Yeah. Well, that's about your work.
Yeah.
But what about you as a man? People that got to dine with you, drink with you, spend time with you, what would you like to be remembered as or for?
Well,
to them?
I mean, it's funny that you ask about romance or about passion or love. I mean, I have so much respect and just kind of immediate connection with people that I feel have that sort of deep love for anything.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't matter what it is. And, when my son was young, that was the thing I always told him. I was like, I do not care what you decide to do for a living. All I care about is that you find your thing, that you find something that makes you wake up in the morning and get out of bed eager to go do whatever that thing is.
Yeah.
It's just about finding a passion. And I would hope that people would remember the way that I found tremendous joy anytime you find someone who's got a thing and knows what it is and is pursuing it.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I've tried whenever possible, when I have a position as a teacher, as an editor, anytime I've got some sort of a platform to try to promote people who are doing that work that they care about.
Right. Yeah.
I think a lot of times in this world, the writing world, the journalism world, there's a kind of tendency to still have that mentality of a kind of zero-sum game, that we're all competing with each other and trying to beat each other out. And my opinion is that the resources are so scant these days, and the whole world of
attention span.
Yeah, exactly. It's all so under attack that it doesn't make sense for us to be fighting with each other. I mean, and so when I see work that I love and want to promote, I see a writer who's doing great work, a photographer, an artist, a musician, I just try to be kind of a big mouth about that. I want people to know. I don't want it to be something that I'm keeping private for myself.
I love that.
I want it to be about community, and I hope people, if they look back at some point, that they would remember me as somebody who wanted to kind of bring people around the table.
I didn't know going into this conversation that we would have that same characteristic, but that's same, building a community, making sure that no one's left out, because I was left out a lot as I was a kid.
Yeah.
You know. So we got an amazing response, mind you. We got 2 questions left for you.
Okay.
And this one, I want it to be really focused, because I normally leave it a little bit more open. But let's say you could have a drink with any musician, living or deceased. Who might you like to? It doesn't matter where, anywhere in the world. Who might you like to have a drink with?
Wow, that's so. This is an interesting one for me. So I'm such a diehard Beatles fan.
Okay,
I'm gonna start from there.
Nice.
I'm just gonna say that.
Favorite record, by the way?
Probably the White Album, just because
Really?
because it contains all of the extremes.
That's a great point. It's a caricature of the Beatles almost. Yeah.
Every color in their palette was represented there. I love the kind of joyful chaos of it.
That brilliant way to put it. Yeah.
But then there's the challenge of like, what one person speaks for the Beatles.
I love that. I can't wait to see where this is going.
And maybe, I mean, this comes back to the previous conversation. I mean, it would probably be John Lennon, because he didn't ever get to that point where he was able to look back on the Beatles with some sense of reflection and satisfaction, and seeing the legacy of it. Even, when he died, he was, only 10 years removed from the end of the Beatles, and was still trying to escape that shadow.
Right.
And so we've had years and years of Paul McCartney kind of reflecting on that legacy. And George Harrison died young, but he lived long enough to kind of reckon with all of that. And Ringo, of course, that's kind of what he does, is reflect on all of these things. But John never had that opportunity.
Man, that's such an interesting perspective on it, because it's so true. Because he died in December of 1980, right?
Right.
How old was he when he passed? I can't remember.
He was 40 years old. Yeah.
40. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think you and I both probably didn't know then at 40 what we know now about love, about the world, about ourselves.
Yeah.
And to think that he could come back and come together, so to speak, to change his tune.
Yeah.
Because he and Paul, I think, were even barely talking, but talking at that point,
Yeah.
That's such an amazing thread in this conversation, right?
Yeah.
The people died too soon.
Yeah.
So, definitely, there's some wood over here, but I'm not going to. But I think it's a really amazing way. And so, it's funny is I never know how these conversations are going to start. I always treat them as if they were, I'm going to give you the guitar, I'm going to play the drums, and we're just going to go, right?
Right.
And the top of the hour, before we started recording, you said you didn't necessarily have the clearest way yet to describe the book.
Right.
You've managed to define the book in these beautiful, colorful stories and characteristics. And you don't even have to, you've been talking about the book, but you're talking about yourself too. You know what I mean? So these stories are very riveting, and I am so drawn to them. I'm drawn to you and the book. Right? So somehow you've sold it without even trying to sell the book, right? Which I think is a beautiful, natural orator quality that you have. And so the last question is, I know you were in Tucson.
Yeah.
Shad ate it up. He was so glad to meet you. He was a great friend. And then you were in San Antonio. We're in San Antonio now, but you did the book festival.
Yeah.
You'll be in Las Almas Rotas in May in Dallas talking about this book again. What's next for you? Is it the traveling? Is it the tour? And do you like the tour?
Yeah, so I mean, it is a really different experience right? Because when I first started this project, it was a lot of travel and interviews and kind of being out in the fields and in distilleries, and it was really social. And then when I realized what I wanted to do was write a history, it got much more solitary. Mm-hmm. Suddenly I was in archives and engaged primarily with documents, and there was a little bit of negotiation with people to try to get access to collections and that sort of thing. But there were hours and hours that were spent alone, and not just in the research then, but in, when I'd photograph documents, sitting and transcribing them and, trying to read 19th century handwriting and translate 19th century Spanish. And so it was this kind of disappearance into this whole sort of private world and trying to construct it one document at a time. And then especially during the pandemic, all the archives then closed down. And so I couldn't even access new materials. It was just like literally being at home, going through the stuff that I'd already amassed and trying to work with those materials until everything would reopen.
Yeah.
And so for a decade or more, this project has been so much about alone time, about being sort of
in the studio,
in my own head, building this whole world inside my skull. And so it's a strange thing to suddenly be like, okay, now
tell us all about
talk about it. and it's wonderful. It's really exciting to have this moment where it's a real thing now. The object is created. The book is something that people can start to read, and it's been wonderful to hear back from people who are like, oh, first of all, now I see why it took so long. But the sort of level of narrative detail that I was going for, why it took so long to assemble all that. But it's also, it is just it's a different thing, because it has been so much this like sort of like hermitage for a decade. And I have a journalist friend who it's haunted me that he told me this years ago, that he said, that he thought that every journalistic project was its own monastery. And I was like, this has been my monastery for almost a quarter of my life. Wow. That monastic notion is pretty spot on. You sit there.
That's a really great comparison.
With the documents, transcribing one to the next and trying to piece this together and preserve it in some way. And it's this activity where you're essentially deciding, I'm not going to live this part of my life in order to preserve something for people who mostly I'm not going to meet. And so it's wonderful for the one brief time that people are excited about it to say, okay, yes, let's definitely have the conversations. Let's talk about it. I'm excited. And it is weird too to suddenly be in this thing where like stories that have been rattling in my head for years, that suddenly other people know them now too, which is great.
It takes us right back to the dinner table.
Yeah,
it really does.
Yeah.
So I'm going to end this in a particular way, because I was reading about some correspondence you've had with your father. But first, let's say, Ted, really a pleasure. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you. This has been great.
Really enriching for me personally, and I could sit in one of your lectures and I would luxuriate into the language and the tone of your voice. So I really appreciate you taking the time out. But back to work, Ted.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers. Well, there we have it. Ted Genoways and his new book, Tequila Wars, A Bloody Tale. And there's some insights in this conversation. You get to understand his process and his kind of cinematic lens, in a way, of which he crafted this new book. It was amazing sitting down talking to Ted. I thank my friend Ernesto for making the introduction. Really a life-changing interview, something that I love doing this, but this is one of those that, I put in the back of my mind. It's like, this is a really special moment speaking with Ted. And the good thing is, if you happen to be in Dallas, Texas, this Sunday, May 4th, Ted is doing a book tour. He's going to be here in Texas, and he's going to be at Las Almas Rotas, where you can enjoy amazing mezcal and tequila. And no, I'm not getting paid for this. This is probably my favorite mezcaleria in Texas. But check Ted out. And you can DM me for details. I'll put as much as I can into the post. But hear the man talk about the history of tequila. That will be a very, very special evening indeed. So thanks everybody for listening to Show to V. No matter how many Gordon Ramsay shows they release, you're going to keep watching them. Or if you're thinking, I better head down to pick these bottles up before it's too late, please keep dancing.